Hello and welcome to the Armin Show podcast, Science, People, Creativity, Learning More, and Expanding Our Framework. Our guest today, coming from Copenhagen, normally at University of Cambridge in England, we have Cecilie Traberg. Cecilie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad to have you on the program. You are in the realm of psychology, and in the field of psychology, you look at things like influence, identity, interaction, judgment, beliefs, and behaviors. How did you get into the categories you are in? Why those versus other ones? Why psychology versus a different category?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've thought quite a bit about it, how I ended up in this field. I think, well, my first degree was in marketing and psychology. I thought I wanted to work in a business in marketing, trying to kind of persuade people, market things, do like market strategy, branding, etc. Um, and I was interested in that because I was interested in human behavior and understanding like why we buy things, why we act the way we do, why we prefer certain products and brands, etc. But I think I quite quickly figured out that I'm not that interested in the end goal of marketing. I'm actually much more interested in understanding like the influence part, how we influence people. And after my after doing a master's degree um, in social cognition, which was a lot more focusing on biopsychology and understanding what actually goes on in the brain. I kind of got a more, I guess, rounded understanding of how our minds are influenced. And I discovered the work of my current supervisor, Sander van der Linden, who looks at basically the opposite of influence, which is how to prevent influence. And I jumped right into that because I thought, what better way of using what I already know about kind of almost a form of negative influence, how we kind of persuade people to do things they don't necessarily want? How can I apply that to actually teaching people the opposite, how to resist being persuaded, specifically in the realm of misinformation? So that's how I ended up where I am right now.
You have a superb supervisor. How much of your research is guided by your supervisor versus how much is your own direction?
I think I'm very lucky and fortunate to have a very hands-off supervisor. Um, I think he's the type of supervisor who guides me when I need to be guided, but lets me kind of run loose when I want, which has been really nice. I think the majority of the studies that I've gotten to do, I have designed or kind of come up with myself, and I throw everything on his table, and I'm like, this is what I want to do, and he helps me kind of narrow it down and figure out how to go about it in the best way, um, based on all his expertise. So I would say it's a really good, yeah, PhD student supervisor relation, because you really have to find the type of supervisor who, I guess, can kind of meet you where you are and see what your needs are. Some supervisors are a lot more hands-on if you need them to be. I think he would be as well if I needed him to be, but I've really enjoyed kind of getting to explore what it's like to be a scientist by also learning how to fail and kind of sometimes doing things that maybe don't turn out the best way. And because that's what it's like to be a scientist. You have to learn by doing. Yeah.
We have to take some failures in. Failures teach us sometimes way more than a
Yeah.
success because you just traverse through the success.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
A failure, you get all the feedback. You're like, okay, now you really feel it. Success, sometimes you don't feel it as much too because it just
Yeah.
worked, so you
Yeah.
didn't really pay attention.
And I think my supervisor is also quite good at um yeah, like being he's willing to like take a bet with some of the things that I wanna look at that aren't necessarily straightforward, in science, especially like in academia, a lot of things are only really seen as successes if you find that there's a significant effect. If you find, something grand and major. And you just don't always know if you're going to find that when you try to test different hypotheses. And I think he's also someone who's like willing to go not just the safe route, but also trying new things and trying to kind of, yeah, um, being open to new methods and new theories, and testing things out and see where we go. But of course, that sometimes means that you end up with results that don't really show that much, which is also something you learn from, because it's just as important to find out what isn't true as it is to find out what is true.
This is a strong point, and we can't always base things on just the grand portions, because if we just look at the little grand portions of existence, then that would mean, let's say, in a whole person's existence, only these 2 years really mattered, and the other
Yeah.
78 were just passing the time in some form. But that's not the case. They're actually
Yeah.
united in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I think also, for example, I did a research-based master's before I did the PhD at Cambridge as well, with the same supervisor, and in that I think it was a nice kind of trial PhD, because I got to kind of, yeah, test out an experiment that basically showed very little, which also taught me something about how to actually go about testing what you want to test, and how you're gonna kind of, yeah, I guess truly explore what you want to explore, because that's what psychology is all about. Like, you want to study the mind and you want to study behavior, but how do you for sure know that you are studying what you think you are studying? I think that's also part of the, I guess, researcher career process, is that you find out how you're supposed to study what you think you're studying. Yeah.
These are important life. I always connect things back to life concepts. Now, in the category of influence and then not being influenced, they're both important. In the category of causing influence, where does your research more lie today? Is it more on causing influence or not being influenced in
Hmm.
a negative direction, for example?
I think it's 50-50. So, but I don't necessarily look at how individuals influence individuals, but I instead try to look at how the context information is presented in might influence the way we see that information. Um, so, for example, how does what everyone else believe about information impact how we see information? So those people might not necessarily be kind of strategically trying to influence us, but just people talking around us, sharing their opinions, not with the intent of deceiving us or influencing us, might influence us anyway. Um, Same thing with source characteristics, how we kind of respond differently to different sources who are trying to influence us. Not all sources are kind of directly and intentionally trying to influence us, but some source effects are stronger than others, and some source characteristics are stronger than others. And I kind of look at different characteristics and different factors in the social context of information, and how those factors influence how we see that information, regardless of whether someone is intentionally trying to influence us. And that's sort of one side of the coin. And I use that information to better understand how we can prevent that influence. But in order to be able to prevent it, I first need to understand what's going on, how it's happening in the first place, so that I can integrate it into these interventions that teach people how to resist those forms of influence.
Does it limit influence on a person when they get the sense that it is an actual effort that the other side or the other individuals are making, versus if they can't tell that it's an effort and it's just happening somewhat subconsciously?
Yeah, I think so. So, if we kind of know that someone is trying to persuade us or deceive us or influence us, uh, we're often kind of a lot more focused on what it is that they're actually saying and processing it, maybe more deeply and more skeptically. than if we aren't aware that there's kind of an intent behind. For example, if you just think about a field like advertising, a good ad is one that makes you feel something and not from the beginning makes you kind of aware this person is trying to shove something down my throat. But a good advertisement is essentially one that just leaves you being like, and eventually leads to you buying something or acting on that. But if you from the beginning are like aware that someone is trying to persuade you, it might cause you to kind of scrutinize things a bit more and be more skeptical, because we don't like to think that we are influenced by other people, or that we generally like to think that we make our judgments and have our own attitudes ourselves, that we aren't really kind of impacted that strongly by other people's efforts at changing those. So I think once we become aware that someone is trying to do that, it's not that it's impossible. Sometimes we are very aware that someone is trying to influence us, but it does. I think it can also sometimes be a sign of a not good influencer when it becomes too obvious.
Right. There is something to that. It's almost like I saw this video recently where Jeff Bezos said that long ago, we don't want truth in a society, so the people that were just going along to get along, they lived and procreated, and the truth tellers would maybe be clubbed to death at night. And the same thing with, let's say, an advertisement or a message. If there's too much direct truth or the unflattering nature of reality showcased in it that the person is already avoiding in their existence, like, oh, I'm not part of that, and you bring that up, it might be the actual thing, but now the person's confronted with that, and that's not comfortable. Too much prefrontal cortex usage. I want to head over to something else that's more pleasant or comfortable, and then that's the successful persuasion. Is there something to that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I remember getting another question when I gave a talk on misinformation. And someone in the audience asked, like, oh, but do people really care about whether or not they are influenced by misinformation? Um, and I think that there's some research that shows that some people don't really care that much if they're influenced by misinformation, whether or not what they're sharing is accurate. A lot of people care, but some people don't. But what I think is really universal is that none of us like to think that we are kind of um, influenced or persuaded, and like our minds are changed by something that isn't true. We just like to think that we are kind of good at judging these things ourselves, but no one likes to think that they are susceptible to um, kind of, yeah, deceptive influence.
It's like there's differentiation in how much truth the person is concerned about coming in or sharing, but everybody agrees they don't want to look stupid or feel like they were outdone or
Yeah,
outpowered.
yeah, exactly, that their minds were somehow altered without them being aware that it was happening.
Mm-hmm. It's like a feeling of lack of control or lack of ability that I don't know anybody that want to identify with that.
Yeah, exactly. Because we do like to think that we're kind of very conscious of our own judgments and beliefs, that they weren't, um, subtly influenced without us knowing it. Because we like to think that we came to those conclusions through kind of very reasoned arguments.
With agency, and it was of our
Yeah,
doing.
exactly.
This is true. Now, you brought up misinformation. This is an important topic that I think will get way more societal discussion happening on it in the next 8 years, because you can, maybe in 2 years, maybe shorter, you can make a video of me saying other stuff that I'm not saying actually, or videos of whatever is being edited. The level of misinformation will be off the charts in the next 5 to 10 years as compared with what we have today.
Yeah.
We don't want to be impacted by that, and there will probably be ways to counter that, but what kinds of concepts will come up in people's minds as there is more misinformation? What will they have to deal with?
Well, there are a lot of things. So, I mean, Misinformation has gotten worse in the last 5 to 10 years because of the speed of the internet and social media. So it's not that there wasn't misinformation before, but now it can be spread a lot more quickly and also created a lot more easily, right? It's also become a lot easier for sources to appear credible because initially news sites would just pop up, but they would kind of appear very homemade, and at the same time, misinformation researchers and policymakers and educationalists were trying to say, well, the main thing you have to focus on is assessing a source's credibility, and that will keep you safe, right? But now sources are becoming a lot better at, and fake news sources at deceiving users and making them appear a lot more credible than they actually are. Obviously, the same thing with AI. Anything can be generated. Deep fakes. You can make a video that looks like anyone now, which is, on some aspects fun and some aspects really scary. Um, because it means that it becomes easier to deceive. And as we kind of, as misinformation researchers are trying to um, boost people's ability to kind of spot these underlying misleading strategies, um, the opposing side is also getting better at using them in more subtle ways and being kind of more discreet about misinformation. And I think maybe the most important thing and the most scary thing right now is that um, misinformation is even being debated as to whether or not it is actually a problem and who is spreading misinformation. So, kind of mislabeling of true information and factual information as misinformation is also a problem because it just becomes a finger pointing game where anything we disagree with, we can just now call misinformation. And it puts it makes people question um, information overall and can lead to a complete trust crisis. So now in the end, no one will know what to trust at all, and instead kind of yeah um, lose we risk losing faith in science and institutions and facts in general, which I think is a really scary image.
It is. I've always been science oriented, so I'm not a fan of that image. Does this cause, as it progresses, does it cause people to either retreat back to their very direct visual local communities that they're people like, oh, it's right in front of me, I can see it? Or there has to be some sort of very reliable way to verify what is being seen, like some say through the blockchain of like having everything verified.
Yeah,
Okay, the person that created it put the timing on it, so it's part of the system. Does
yeah.
it need to be one of those?
Um, I think it's hard to say what it needs to be, but I think what definitely is happening is that people are, I guess, becoming more aware of how to identify where things come from. But at the same time, we see like a wave of individuals turning to alternative sources of information instead. So being like, okay, I can't trust the media, I can't trust the institutions, I can't trust, I don't know who to trust, so I'm going to trust individuals. So instead, people are, turning to Gen Z is turning to social media, and not social media in terms of like news organizations posting on social media, but individuals sharing stories. And this is becoming a lot more pervasive that people turn to individuals as news sources instead. So instead of, relying on a journalist, they rely on individuals who are kind of at the scene or posting as an individual. And in some ways, this is good because it kind of brings, I guess, agency to individuals and allows for more kind of direct news sharing. It doesn't have to go through a medium, but at the same time, it also um, can be a really kind of dangerous issue in terms of credibility because uh, there's no way of verifying what an individual is saying to the same extent. It doesn't go through kind of classic journalistic editing and processing, which is also sometimes bad, but there's kind of no check point for what information gets shared. So it's become kind of like a free for all news market, which increases access, but also increases misinformation.
I've thought about this concept quite a bit, such that let's say there are now tens of thousands of Twitter influencers that have built a backlog of their material and they've been consistent and they have a following, but there really isn't any check on what they're doing. So if they decided to just start throwing in little pointers about something to direct people in a certain way, there's no counterpoint to it. There might be some commenters that say something here and there, but that gets quieted in the comments, but they could kind of adjust things. There's no correction point in that. What is going to be the larger check on that? Or does that mean the whole public starts to become more distant from this kind of news versus the previous kind of news? There wasn't that.
I think it's I don't think I think it's hard to predict what's going to happen. I can just kind of comment on what is happening, and it's reminding me a bit of what happened with like ads as we were talking about before. I previously studied marketing. When I was studying marketing in 2013, we were learning about like trust and how people have lost faith in marketeers and advertisers, and no one trusts that, brands and corporations are actually telling the truth. Um, which and all these kind of marketing professors were saying like, oh, so marketeers don't know what to do. Like, how do they kind of um, increase trust in their branding and their ads and their marketing? Because people kind of see them as these like big block institutions who are just kind of not human. There's like a human element missing to it. And then fast forward just 5 years, and almost all ads, and 10 years especially, you won't find a company that doesn't use influencers to market their products. It's become like the most used form of advertising, right? Like because people trust individuals instead of brands. And I think kind of we see the same thing happening with news, that people have lost trust in journalists and institutions. Not everyone, but many people have, and this leads them to follow individuals. But at the same time, we've now seen with influencers a kind of a wave of the opposite, where people are now not trusting influencers anymore either, because they're kind of learning that, well, influencers have the same motivations as marketeers. They're also trying to make a profit. They're just acting as individuals instead. And that might be something that we would see in the future, is that, people who share fake news individually or share kind of fear-mongering stories on social media as individuals might also in 5-10 years time be looked to in similar ways as journalists and media companies are, because there are always intentions behind what we share on social media.
This is a very good point, actually. That one right there, the intentions behind what people share on social media. Sometimes it's more obvious. In some ways, sometimes the salesperson, even though it's very salesy, at least it's very clear. And then, whereas another person might not be doing sales, but is trying to influence a certain rhetoric or impact a few people to like them more in some way, and it's much more under the radar. And how do you discern what are ways to discern what the person is trying to get across to you actually from their end?
Yeah, I think I mean, deciphering someone's intentions can be difficult, but so in a way I don't really have a good answer for that, but I guess something that I recommend in general when kind of deciphering what is true and false is looking at the masses. Like, if something is being reported consistently, even by individuals, it is more likely to be true than if it's kind of one sole individual acting alone. Um, and it's always possible to think of or to consider whether or not someone might have ulterior motives. Like if you could think of a motive, what would it be? And if you can think of one and it sounds likely, then it probably is true that that is what they're kind of intending. Um, but but yeah, it can be quite difficult to decipher. Often we first find out when it's too late or when it gets retracted. So that's another thing to be aware of is when individuals share misinformation, whether they're kind of directly sharing a false story or an exaggerated story, or they're just resharing something that's fake. There's no kind of risk in terms of anything kind of any negative consequences for them if that story turns out to be false compared to like a news agency. Um, there's kind of more at stake. If you create a fake profile on social media, that I mean that's another way to kind of figure out whether someone has like negative intentions or intentions to deceive is whether or not the profile looks like it's false or not. Is it like a someone who's kind of has a network of friends and seems to be like a legitimate person, then there is a little bit more at stake for them if they are kind of coming up with misinformation compared to if it's just a fake profile.
Understand that one. Has elements of how much skin in the game you have, like Nicholas Nassim Taleb's
Yeah,
book or concept.
yeah.
If there is a lot there that the person would need behind them that they're backing up for what they do, or if a lot they would lose based on what they're saying, or if they say something they say one way to know if it's a truth is that if they would say something that would make them look bad and they're still saying it, it's likely it's more on the truth end, because who would do that to take away their elements? But these kinds of things are signs of you're dealing with a person that's actually there,
Mm-hmm.
or a corporation or entity, versus it's a made up item with some sort of agenda behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another thing to also look at is what that person has shared before. So is it like, are they kind of like a serial sharer in terms of information, and what is the kind of the overall rhetoric of the rest of the information that they share? For instance, I came across an individual who was sharing misinformation in relation to a big attack that happened in Copenhagen 2 years ago, and this person was sharing kind of misinformation about what was going on during that attack, which was later refuted. But when you kind of evaluated what this person's social media profile looked like in general, there was a lot of kind of hateful rhetoric on the profile in general, not related to that attack in particular, but just a lot of hateful and negative, very polarizing content. And as such, that kind of, I guess, can lead you to think that this person might have an agenda, and an agenda doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's fake. It just means that you have to be aware that there is an agenda with what they're saying. Just like ads can be have an agenda, but they don't necessarily have to be trying to trick you, but they're trying to persuade you, and that's something to be aware of too.
There's the element of agenda versus not so much, and then there's the element of the truthfulness and not so much, and then you have
Mm-hmm.
to put those together. Agenda by itself doesn't have so much negativity with it, though there is some lightness to when there's an individual that doesn't really seem to have some sort of agenda.
Yeah.
There's some peacefulness there. You're like, oh, okay, they're just kind of floating through the wind in a way.
Yeah, so 'cause sometimes like you can also have an agenda to, I guess, maintain a certain identity or online image. Like you might be sharing information in general because it's kind of you want to use that to highlight who you are as a person. And that doesn't have to be news. It's just sometimes people like to share information and images on social media to kind of build their digital self. And that's also an agenda. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It's just yeah, something you have to be aware of.
This digital self, I saw something that said that you only know 2% of a person's life. So something like a small portion is the actual digital self that's showcased, and then the
Mm-hmm.
rest is conveniently left out, all the life details or mundane parts or other elements. Is it Does this continue, this trend that we've had in recent years where you do this 2%, you make it a thing, you leave out the other thing? Whereas I think with the younger crew, Gen Z and whatnot, they like to make that 2% more like 10, 15, or 20 or 30 or 40%, or else they don't really identify with it because they've seen the 2% thing happen before. Does it keep going further? Do you see a trend in the way we go as far as how we present ourselves?
Yeah, I guess people are becoming a bit more truthful on social media in general, as you say, particularly the younger generation. But I also do think that there is like I mean, this is maybe just a personal analysis. I'm not sure whether there'd be research to back this up, but that it's also strategic when people share more and share more kind of negative things on social media as well. It's all about trying to present kind of the full image, but it's also strategic. And in a way, before we were just sharing the highs, and now it's kind of become more popular to also share the lows, which does which has the positive consequence that we kind of see more of ourselves in each other because we recognize that other people might be going through similar issues as us. But I think that there is always kind of um, either intentionally or unintentionally a kind of strategy behind sharing negative and kind of more mundane things on social media as well, because it's all kind of part of portraying who we are. And before that, who we had to be was perfect, and now we have to be real, but it's still something we kind of have to be in order to be accepted on social media, because now we're kind of no longer accepting the perfect image because we know that it's um, just simply a portrayal and not reality. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't assume that the real presents itself is actually the real one either.
I've noticed since the beginning of the internet, there has never, from then till now, been a thing where people share every single thought and feeling they have, plus video of themselves 24 hours a day for weeks and weeks on end. That's never happened since the beginning because that was not it. It doesn't have the curated some sort of strategy or something to it, or else that would just be your neighbor right there. It's
Mm-hmm.
just right there. It wouldn't have been watched. So there's like the percentage has changed over time of how much or which parts or what people want and don't want. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like a wave that everybody follows along. Because if
Yeah,
you do the thing
exactly.
now from the
Yeah,
thing before, it would have been off. And if you did the thing before the thing now, it would have been
exactly.
off.
And I remember when Instagram kind of started in 2013, uh, I got it as well. And everyone at that time was sharing the most mundane things. Nothing was polished. Like this was pictures of people's like uh sloppy egg fried rice and like really really ugly looking food and every nothing was polished, and then it gradually became more polished, so I think it kind of started out as like people trying to escape Facebook, where people's parents had, and grandparents had started coming on, so trying to kind of create a new space. And then people were like, well, what am I supposed to share? Well, here are my shoes, and here's my porridge. And gradually it had to become more polished, as it also became like a tool to kind of market yourself and not just share with your immediate social circle, which it originally started as.
This is true. The pattern switch. That's funny. The porridge. Long live the porridge. Now, let's say you're the average individual and you have your phone and you are wanting to have your day not be influenced much by outside sources except where you want to take them in. How do you do that carefully? That's so that your day is your day, and you're looking at what you examine. How do you do that so that you don't get sucked into different funnels of influence?
Yeah, that's I guess the million-dollar question is how we avoid being influenced in general. So I think maybe the first thing I would say is that influence doesn't have to be negative. Um, it's just more negative if it's highly biased. So I think, it's good and it can be important to uh, stay updated and keep up with what's going on in the world. That's not necessarily negative, being reading news and paying attention to what's going on, following different people who you trust and maybe who you like doesn't have to be a bad thing. But if your social media feed becomes an echo chamber, that's when it can like be really have a much greater impact on your thoughts and your mindset. And I think maybe the biggest thing two main things I would say. So one is to like try to maintain a balanced kind of portfolio of what you are choosing to follow on social media so that you kind of have a balance. I think it's unrealistic to advise people to not use their phones at all and just kind of avoid all influence because I also think that that can be negative. We need to be able to rely on news sources in general. And I think, to be honest, maybe some people will sincerely disagree, but in the field that I am in, I think the worst thing you can do is tell people to do their own research, which is what they will do if they aren't kind of willing to accept information in from anywhere. I think we just have to be a lot better at scrutinizing where that information is coming from and the sources we rely on. Um, so that would be kind of my main recommendation is to try to keep it not biased. And then number two, and the second one is to be hyper aware of algorithms and where you're being taken without necessarily being wanting to be taken there. So, for example, going down a YouTube rabbit hole that you haven't necessarily realized you have gone down, or that can happen on TikTok within literally like 6 swipes. You might be in a TikTok rabbit hole of people spreading misinformation. So I think it's just, yeah, stopping to think sometimes whether or not you ended up where you ended up on the internet intentionally or unintentionally. And if it's unintentional, then someone else is trying to influence you and probably in a negative way.
That's a strong point there. If you ended up there and it wasn't really your plan, you probably got someone else's plan placed on you in some way.
Hmm. And it's
That's an
like,
interesting one.
I think another point in relation to that is that when we accept information and you kind of end up going down some rabbit hole, once you accept some information, it's going to take you down it like algorithms might take you down somewhere slightly more extreme and a little bit more extreme, but it's so subtle that you don't realize that each kind of tweak in veracity of the information or extremity or the kind of whether or not the information is polarizing might be such a subtle tweak that you don't realize it's going on. And I mean, the mind works in such a way that once you've or accepted kind of one piece of information, you're more likely to accept the next because it's so subtle, such subtle difference. And we don't like cognitive dissonance. We don't like to kind of reassess once we've already kind of accepted something to be true. Then ergo, the next thing must be true as well, because we don't like to think that we were just kind of silly in accepting the previous statement, right? So it can quickly, the mind can kind of quickly be led astray, and nowadays this can happen just within minutes.
A lot of valuable points right there. The multiplicative nature of the internet, where you go into a thing and then that category multiplies on itself, and you get more of that, and you see that, and you're reminded of that, and you see that, and now it's like that little bit got expanded into a whole world there. That's a strong one. And then what you just said there afterwards. What was the last thing you just said there after that?
Well, that you might like the cognitive dissonance, like you don't like
Oh,
to.
right. That part there are weaknesses any of our potential weaknesses would be used by algorithms against. So if someone has ego, or they have insecurity, or they have what is that, withdrawal, or they had somebody depart from them,
Mm-hmm.
or any sort of life element that impacts the person, is something that the algorithm can latch onto.
Mm-hmm.
And then once it's latched on, you went in the category, then it multiplies it, and now you're in this world that you wouldn't have been in if it was just a random assortment of content showing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's a strong one there. What if a person is? Do you look often more? You look more at people, or organizations, or governments, or the conceptual, what's happening behind the scenes? Which one would you say you look at the most?
Mostly people. Yeah, so I look at how, I guess, people influence people, and especially kind of considering um, multiple people at once, kind of considering that the persuasion process isn't necessarily just a unidimensional relationship between the kind of influencer and the message receiver, or the communicator and the message receiver, that there's so much else going on. And I kind of try to look at the whole image of what's going on, what's everyone else doing, all the characteristics of the source, everything kind of going on the receiver's end. Yeah, so not so much at organizations themselves. But I look at news sources. So I guess you could say that they are organizations, but I almost consider them as like an individual with several different source characteristics.
Is it pretty clear whether the individuals or groups that have the most impact online are highly strategic, or not strategic at all and just doing a lot? Is there something to being highly strategic? Is that the one that wins out clearly? Is there something to this?
I think there are two things. So, I mean, one is being highly strategic. I guess that kind of covers many different dimensions of how to be successful in influencing others on social media. Um, but something that works both strategically as well as unintentionally is being extreme and provocative. That often gets a lot of attention. Being willing and able to spread things that are somewhat shocking and highly emotional is also going to get you a lot of attention. And the thing is that people can do that strategically. And if you do that strategically, you can really influence a lot of people. But you can also do that unintentionally. But it will kind of have the same amount of influence whether or not you intended for that influence to occur or not, because our brains just love this form of extreme information, things that kind of both feed into our biases and sound shocking and alarming. That's kind of what we're drawn to, um, because I mean, one reason for that is that the brain kind of picks up on irregularities in the environment. You know, you might read like 10 things that you kind of know to be true, and they kind of confirm what you think already, and it's not that shocking. But wow, you're gonna stop at that headline or that tweet or that news article or that individual sharing something uh, that's shocking, and you're going to be more likely to believe it if it also is kind of emotional and plays into your existing biases, whether these are political or otherwise.
This is a neat point, that so if you're strategic, you might do a lot of that more often on purpose, and then if you're not strategic, you might once in a while by happenstance cause such a reaction, but it was just connected with your life or something you were saying, and then it had the effect. It has sort of the what works concept, which I was never a fan
Mm-hmm.
of before. But if it works, and then if it you didn't plan it, but it still quote works, then
Mm-hmm.
it has the intended effect.
But I guess often people are better at getting it to work if they are strategic about it. Like for instance, there something that requires being really strategic is having a strong um, like persona or profile as a source, because people really do pay a lot of attention to which source is actually sharing this information. I mean, people, number one, pay attention to what's being shared more so than the source. But in order to evaluate whether that's likely to be true or not, if it's not totally extreme and plays into our biases, we also look at the source. And if you're able to kind of strategically hit all those points that are going to make people think, oh, this source is credible, you're going to be a lot more likely to influence people with whatever message it is you have, no matter how shocking or emotional or whatever neutral it might be. And that can both take, knowledge of what makes a source influential and appear to be credible, but it can also just, take effort and time. Like, for example, building up a fake troll or Twitter account that appears to be someone um, highly credible takes a lot of time and effort, because people are now kind of better at picking up on these official cues. So if you're able to really play on these cues well, you're going to be more successful. Like an example I can think of is there was recently a really prominent academic and researcher that I was a big fan of for the last 10 years who started following me on Twitter. And I was really excited. And I went to see and I went to look at his profile, and I thought it looked legit because he had like 15,000 followers on Twitter, which I thought maybe he would have had more. I was more thinking like 40,000, but seemed legit. Like 15,000, you wouldn't have that if you were like a fake account. But then I noticed that the name was a little bit weird. There was just one letter that was off in the name, and he wasn't verified. And he started writing to me on Twitter as well. And then I very quickly found the real academic profile, who actually had like 45,000 followers on Twitter and was verified, etc. And I started like playing along with this Twitter troll, and asking them, why they weren't verified yet, and that I had been a big fan of their work for a really long time. And they started saying things like, "Oh, this profile is going to get verified soon. I'm just kind of transferring over to this profile," and started like trying to have a conversation. And in the end, I kind of revealed that I knew the truth, and I was like, well, as a misinformation researcher, I'm sorry, but I can't, you know, continue to follow someone who's spreading misinformation. And then I got blocked within, 1 second of sending that message. And I reported the profile, right? But 1 week later, it had changed to another famous person on Twitter with one letter different in the name. And I kept reporting it for, I think, four months. But it just kept being a different person, Every time it got kind of, I guess, blocked for very temporarily for impersonating someone else, they just, changed their name. And this was how they were kind of able to maintain and create such a large following, because people like me who just see like the profile for 1 second and think, oh, that looks real because they have so many followers, just blindly follow, and it just ends up appearing to be someone credible. And this can then help them get more followers and more followers and more followers. But obviously it requires a lot of effort and a lot of strategy. And they're then trying to, appear to be this person, and within like every 10 tweets, then insert like a strategic message. So like 9 out of 10 tweets might be something that person would say if it's a researcher, something about their research. If there was also like a Bitcoin expert they were pretending to be 2 weeks later, it would be something about Bitcoin, But then every 10th tweet might be something kind of slightly political or sharing some news that is more strategic. But yes, it requires strategy and a lot of effort.
You made me think of a few things here. One of them is, by the way, that's something that shows up. I see it on TikTok, where an individual that I follow that's a well-known person, then I get people that follow me that have the same profile picture, almost the same name, name. And I keep getting these now.
Yeah.
So does this connects with the concept I thought about before. Let's say in 2014, 15, 16, 17, a lot of prank videos happened on YouTube where they go prank people in the public. And that's not happening anymore because now the whole public has been pranked at this point, and it's not the same effect as at that time. So it's like I don't want to say the consciousness, but the response from the whole public has gone up to here because they saw it, it happened to their friends or something.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit more effort. Kind of like what you're saying here. This is another example. You see the person, oh, that's not just it's a little bit like, I don't want to, maybe innocence gone, and then more effort that is required of every single person that wants to really do anything. Is the effort to be an upstanding or well-to-do human going up because there's so many items challenging at our humanity that were not happening before?
Sorry, can you elaborate on that question?
Like, is the effort to be a, we'll say, reasonable person in 2024, managing all the items that are jabbing at our minds and algorithms and misinformation, much more effortful than, let's say, 1980, 1940, where there's way less like that's connected to us. Maybe we had horses or agriculture, but it wasn't like our humanity was being directly impinged on repeatedly.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I would say in some ways, yes. Just because we are kind of bombarded and overloaded with information that we kind of have to pay attention to or pay attention to. There are many more things we have to consider. We're much more connected than ever before. And also, there are a lot more kind of sources of information to evaluate, and a lot more of that information. We have access to more information than we've ever had. Whether we kind of want that information or not. So there's a lot more to kind of grapple with. But at the same time, because kind of living standards have in general increased in a lot, and at least a lot of the in a lot of the weird or sorry, non-weird populations, the weird populations have kind of increased in living standards. It means that we kind of have less existential or less kind of less worries related to survival, and now a lot more worries related to just kind of day-to-day life. And I think there's also kind of part of the world that now, you know, has found something different to worry about, because there is not those kind of worries related to whether or not we will actually kind of be able to survive physically, which many parts of the world are still struggling with. And they're probably not worrying about whether or not they're feeling stressed, for example, or slightly, depressed, or thoroughly checking their information sources when it comes to news and politics like that. But we're kind of, I guess, in a good way, we have the mental capacity to do that now, because we don't have all these, much more existential worries that other parts of the world have.
I just got an analogy or a metaphor that came to my mind. It's like some have gotten to the top of a mountain of life stability and reasonable things, but now you're at the top of the mountain, you have a different issue, like there's less oxygen, or maybe you have a great view, but you can't see some of the things on the ground level that you could see before. It's like you get to a certain points, and then there's trade-offs to that you weren't obvious when you were climbing the mountain, because climbing the mountain looks like it's the whole goal. Like I'm up there, that's the victory. But there's no, you look at it from a far off planet, the mountain is not that high off the ground anyway. It's just a little bit different, but it appears to be a completely different world in some form.
In a way, I would agree. And but I almost see it more as like, I don't know if you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs or
Yeah.
hierarchy of needs. Yeah, I feel like it's a bit more like that, where, you know, in order to be able to like have the privilege of worrying about the things that we worry about, it's basically a privilege to be able to worry about those things, because when you're kind of looking for shelter and food, you're not, you know, there's no space to worry about those things. So you're kind of, you know, climbing the hierarchy of those needs. Now there's actually, because you have all those needs met and satisfied already, it becomes something different that we worry about. But that's not to neglect the pervasive influence of misinformation, because I do think that some like worrying about misinformation should be a thing, especially when we are able to, because misinformation is causing a lot of the crises we see around the world that are causing people to not have what they need. So it kind of goes full circle like that.
In your research today or onward, what are some things you are looking at right now or would like to tackle in the upcoming time? What are important focuses of yours now and onward?
I think one thing I'm really interested in is figuring out how we can um, inoculate people against misinformation at scale. So how do we kind of make people better able to resist misinformation, not just at an individual level, but how can we kind of scale this in society? So this, will entail looking at different strategies, like how can making one person more aware of what misinformation is and making one person more resistant and resilient, can that person be part of the spread of the inoculation and of this resistance to misinformation? Can we kind of target key people to be able to spread this resistance to misinformation? And how do we kind of get more vulnerable populations to be willing to engage in this form of intervention or kind of learning about misinformation? Because often the people who are willing to kind of at this point in time participate in these interventions and learn about misinformation are probably the ones who are most resilient to begin with and have an interest in knowing about it. The people we really want to reach are those who don't care and and don't think they should and they need to be kind of resistant to misinformation. And those are the people we really want to target, but the ones who don't want to be targeted, because they also see it as maybe a form of outside influence, even when you're trying to teach them how to not be influenced.
That's funny. Two strong concepts there. One of them, it's like a person can be a pillar of something, like resilience or inoculation against misinformation or strength or consistency or discipline or whatever it is. A person can be that, and then a base of people can branch off of that. That's a strong point for any individual. You can be like a pillar of that. And then the other point you bring up there, of bridging the gap, because like the people who are in the gym are not the people you want to guide about working out more or their fitness or health. The person who's not in the gym is the person you would really want to reach, and they're not at their.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're like having your like fitness membership stand in the fitness center or right next to the fitness center, you're going to target those people who are already going there or who are already there. That's not necessarily who you want to target, but it can be. It's proving a difficult task. So I think that's something I'm trying to work on.
I always think about that when I do anything. The people who are not here, there's a whole world of that. And then the people that are with you, they're actually way more similar to you than you think. You're not really competing with them. And you're not really competing with anybody, but these are more similar to you, and the people who are not participating, it's a different category of individuals. My last question to you, have there been any key people who have influenced your direction, potentially your supervisor, but maybe even earlier, that affected the trajectory of your life? Outside individuals.
Outside individuals?
Like a scientist or a researcher or maybe a distant friend or somebody that you wouldn't have expected, maybe that caused the fork in the road. Is there anybody like that?
Oh, that's a very deep question to end on. I think well, someone that really influenced me was like very or maybe I'll mention two people. So one person was my violin teacher. So I played violin since I was 5, and I had
Cool.
I had many different teachers, but one of them, he was very had a great influence on me. I think he was so passionate about what he did and kind of what the effort he was willing to put into what he was doing, and in kind of teaching how to do that, that it was just it inspired me to be, to be willing to put in effort to kind of get where you want, because he was kind of all about that. And also the whole like paying attention to detail. I think as a person, I can very easily kind of rush off to the next thing, without and sometimes kind of forget to look and scrutinize things in the here and now. But he was really good at kind of picking out the little things and being very kind of perfectionistic. And I think that that kind of taught me the value of kind of spending time getting good at the little things, like the little parts of what you're trying of the bigger picture. And then another person was a teacher in my junior school who really enforced critical thinking in me. She was someone who kind of always encouraged us. She taught literature, social science, and history, and was always teaching us to be critical of whatever we were reading, even if we kind of weren't really supposed to be critical of that, and ask critical questions and consider who's writing this, what is their purpose, can we look at this from different perspectives. She wasn't someone, she'd show us, for example, historical videos from both perspectives in terms of, let's say, like a war, in order to make us realize that there's always kind of a reason for many different sides, and to be able to be more aware of what's going on in both camps, in order to understand how kind of conflict arises, and be very critical of information in general, and be willing to ask critical questions about everything, and be approach the world with a healthy amount of skepticism.
These are key points. Critical, and then also having someone that you see that is bringing their energy towards something, and then, I could bring energy like that towards something as well. These influences have a big impact on our future. That's why we still remember them years later.
Yeah.
It's quite neat. Yeah, you want to have both sides of information. If you start getting into just one, you become more like an island, and we as people are not built to become an island.
Exactly.
Cecilie, I would like to thank you for having joined in this discussion on the program about various topics, including influence and your research. And where might people find your material, and what would you want them to know as like a closing message, if you had one, to all people on the whole planet?
Well, I mean, I have a website, which is my name, CeciliaTraberg.com, which has most of my research and kind of my profile. But like a take home message is maybe to go inoculate yourself against misinformation. Go figure out what inoculation is, what it means, and how to boost your own immunity to misinformation. So if you just Google inoculation and misinformation, you can learn about how that's possible.
Wonderful. Cecilie, thank you for joining on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we are out.